Good afternoon. This is John Gilmore, managing partner here at Barker Gilmore. I'm just going to give us a couple minutes. People are just logging into our system now, so let's just give them at least a couple of minutes here. I'm watching the numbers climb as I'm speaking, so we can get started in just a minute or two. We have a really good program today. Actually, I'm pretty excited about it with some top shelf general counsel joining our panel here, so it should be worth everyone's while to stick around for the hour. So as people are logging in, I'll just say welcome to our General Counsel Advantage program. It's our monthly complimentary webinar series that we put on, basically trying to help people improve their skills and be better advisors to the CEO, the board, and the business. It's working out great. Our attendance has been very high all through the pandemic, so we're really glad people are able to take advantage of it. Today we have a really great topic, and all of our panelists have experienced firsthand and can tell some great stories of what happens when a new GC comes on board and the best tips you can have to address and get the new GC acclimated. Also just keeping in mind, our October 14th webinar series is going to be tips to prepare for your performance evaluation with the General Counsel. And our November 12th webinar is going to be geared towards finding your next job or having it find you. So we're going to have some good tips from GCs that have experienced this before. So it just, everyone always asks how they can get their hands on the content from the webinar. Just letting you know, if you go to barkergilmore.com and click on the resource section, you'll see our webinar series. We have a library that has past webinars. This webinar today is being recorded, and all the content will come live for everyone in about 3 weeks. We'll send an email to all of you just letting you know that it is available, and just feel free to go to our website and or check out some of the past content. We're getting very high marks from the people who have attended it. So we hope you enjoyed today. I'm going to pass it off to one of my favorite Barker Gilmore advisors, Noah Hanf, former General Counsel of MasterCard and former CEO of CPR, Conflict Prevention and Resolution, the alternative dispute resolution nonprofit that serves the world. So it's really amazing to have Noah, and he's brought some great panelists with him.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be with you today. I'm pleased to be joined by two distinguished former general counsels. Susan Blunt served as general counsel for Prudential Financial, which is a Fortune 100 financial services company from 2005 to 2015. In that role, she had responsibility for global law, compliance, business ethics, external affairs, and I'm sure other functions as well. Susan currently serves on the board of CAFCO Industries, a leader in manufactured housing. She's active in not-for-profit work and advancing women's leadership. Also joining me today is Bart Schwartz. Bart began his legal career as a litigator with two major New York-based law firms. For the next 30 years, he held senior in-house positions, including general counsel of 3 public S&P 500 companies. From 2008 to 2017, Bart was chief legal officer of a Fortune 500 multinational specialty insurer. After a failed attempt at retirement since March of 2018, he has been senior counsel with a New York-based a large law firm. Like Bart, I also failed in my efforts to retire, and after leaving the CPR Institute, I'm a full-time arbitrator and mediator with Acumen ADR here in New York. So let's get started. I think we have a great topic today. I'll start by pointing out that the average tenure for a CEO is approximately 10 years, which means for those of you who are or going to be or are general counsels long enough, you'll likely face a CEO transition. And today we're going to talk about the general counsel's role in such a transition, and in particular, how the general counsel can help the CEO have a smooth transition into his or her role, and thereby increase the general counsel's chances of survival. And surviving a new CEO is not a given. Back about 7 years ago, RHR International did some research at which executives and senior managements trying to ascertain the vulnerability of executives and senior management when a new CEO comes in. Now, apart from chief marketing officers, the next most vulnerable member of the executive management team was the general counsel. And interestingly, the average tenure of a general counsel is about 6 years, 4 years less than the CEO. So I would suggest that what we're talking about today is an important issue. So let's start by talking about planning for a CEO transition before her or his departure is imminent. Susan, Bart, we've all been involved in succession planning for our own teams over the years. Let's take a minute and discuss the planning process that a board generally undertakes and the involvement of, if at all, of the general counsel in that process. Susan, if you could start by taking us through the overall formal process for CEO succession planning and how a well-functioning board does or should handle that.
Sure. I think that CEO succession planning is just like succession planning for other senior roles in the organization. I think most well-run organizations have a formal process where on an annual or every 18-month period basis, they do a sort of a comprehensive talent check. They identify, likely, ready now successors and successors who are likely to be ready in 3 to 5 years for all of the senior positions. And the CEO role would be no different for that. So that when you're talking about preparing for a CEO succession, the first step, and again, there will be other steps that we'll discuss later this afternoon, but the first step is being sure that the CEO role, just like the other roles, is being treated in the same way, that the board is regularly, on again, every year to year and a half process, being updated on what the CEO sees in terms of internal successors or lack thereof, and being active, and the board should be actively, if there are no ready now successors in the organization, understanding what the CEO's plans for that are, and what he thinks he or she thinks the board ought to be considering going forward.
But Bart, I assume you've been with a lot of different companies, and I assume the formal process is similar to what Susan described. Well, what about informally? Have you had directors that reach out to you from time to time, or the management team, to get a sense of how the CEO is performing?
Yes, in fact, my last experience with the company from which I was trying to retire involved a CEO succession, which throughout this discussion, I think like all of us, I won't use names, but was not entirely voluntary, although the company went to great lengths to portray it as normal course retirement in the public eye. And one of the, frankly, we had an independent board chair, and one of the first things she did as she and the Nominating and Governance Committee began to think in earnest about creating the process for a transition and succession of the CEO was to reach out to me. In fact, I was in the happy position of being sort of central in the process. The Nom and Governance Committee and the independent board chair tapped me and the Executive Vice President of Human Resources to help run the process, especially the process aspects, which was quite formal and involved use of an outside consultant who was selected after a formal process to interview several. So that was my experience, and it was kind of a good place to be, being able to get in that early on the process.
It's a good segue into CEO departures, which can take place, as we all know, in different ways. some of them relatively smooth, and others quite abrupt. Recognizing that each company and each situation is different, and some departures, as you alluded to, are more planned than others, let's talk a little bit about the different ways CEO transitions can take place. I'll start by giving an example of a planned transition that I went through, or my CEO went through. I worked for a CEO that made it very clear that he wanted to enjoy the beach by the time he hit 60. Unfortunately, the board wanted him to stay until then. So he was fortunate to receive a nice stay retention bonus ending on his 60th birthday. The board was able, because of the timing, to really undertake a thorough, comprehensive search well in advance of a scheduled departure, and was able to bring in his successor as the chief operating officer with the understanding he'd become CEO if he didn't blow himself up. Now, I'm not sure having a lame duck CEO and a CEO in waiting running the company for an extended period is necessarily a good idea, but it really worked, and in part because of the excellent relationship between the two individuals. But I have to say that that elegant handoff sent a message to the staff that the transition would be smooth. And for me, as the general counsel, it gave me the opportunity to prepare for a very different style and a different vision for the company than the prior CEO. But there are other ways that it can happen. It can happen, obviously, from a CEO being frustrated and going elsewhere, or alternatively, a board desiring to ease the CEO out over time, which, as Bart mentioned, can be positioned as voluntary, or a very, very clear involuntary termination. So I think all this leads to the fact that the general counsel needs to really be a keen observer as to what's going on at the board level, and they're in a position to do that because they're often secretary to the board, or the secretary to the board reports to the general counsel. So let's spend a minute or two talking about the warning signs that a general counsel should pick up on in terms of the board being unhappy with the CEO, or the CEO thinking about, possibly exploring greener pastures. Now, I'll say this, some boards are not subtle in terms of showing frustration with management or the CEO. But the general counsel, I think, needs to distinguish between occasional friction, which we've all been through between the board and the CEO, and real warning signs. So, Susan, I'll ask you if you can talk about some of the warning signs that an astute general counsel might be able to pick up on.
So let me start with the disclaimer that the principal transition that I experienced was one that came part of a sort of a natural retirement, and was and was not the subject of this. But honestly, I think looking at how a board is responding to the CEO is no different than looking at the way they respond to other decisions that are put before them, other business plans that are presented to them, other reports that are presented to them. You have to have some EQ. You have to be watching the body language in the room. You have to be, noticing whether people are whispering to one another in the boardroom or outside of the boardroom, whether conversations are stopped abruptly when you walk up, because it's obvious that there are discussions going on. I think that that most GCs have the privilege of being in the boardroom, and I always considered myself, when I was GC, to be a second pair of eyes and ears for both the board and the CEO, to sort of understand what the milieu was, to understand what the the sense of the situation was. But I think that that upcoming transitions generally, if they're involuntary, are going to be clearly telegraphed through your basic body language and nature of questioning that's going on.
Yeah, and sometimes I think something like very long, protracted executive sessions, might also be a clue. And then the flip side is warning signs that the CEO is ready to make a move. I had an experience, again, following the lead of my co-panelists, not alluding to any individual, but I had an experience where the CEO said to me after a very challenging 2 days of board meetings, you know, I don't have to put up with this crap. And I think something like that was not too subtle of a clue. Bart, speaking of that, can you think of other examples that, you know, a general counsel might come upon to give a sense that the CEO is thinking about exploring other options?
You know, Noah, the only very, very subtle cue that I once picked up on was when I walked into the CEO's office, and there, spread out on his desk, and it seemed to be the only thing he was paying attention to, so I knew it was his top priority, was a big color brochure of retirement homes on the golf course in Palm Springs. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think what Susan said is key. The general counsel, especially if the general counsel is also the corporate secretary, which I was, is in a unique position. I wouldn't say the general counsel is between the board and the CEO. Neither the board nor the CEO would ever want that. But you as general counsel are really very much beside the board, standing beside and helping the board and the CEO and helping them in their relationship one and the other. So that, in that regard, as Susan said, I think if you have a little EQ and also watching the body language, you can pick up what's coming down the road. But when I really found out that a transition was in the offing, I was told that by the board, as I mentioned.
Yeah. But by the way, I'm not sure we mentioned this to start, but if there are questions, please feel free to enter them online, and we'll either respond to them on a real-time basis or at the end, obviously time permitting. I want to turn next to something that, again, if you're at GC long enough, you're definitely going to deal with this, and that is tension between the CEO and the board. Not necessarily tension that leads to termination. It could, but periods of tension between the board and the CEO, and how the general counsel gets involved with that. We all recognize that there's a certain sensitivity about the relationship between a CEO and her or his board, particularly with the chair or lead director. Where there is tension, is it best for a general counsel to stand clear of those situations, or involve herself or himself? And Susan, I'll turn to you. What do you think?
Well, I guess I would say that I think that a GC should get involved, and I don't mean banging on the table and so forth. But if you see tension, and you're not sure that the board is reading the CEO right, or the CEO is reading the board right, but you've had the benefit of sort of sitting there quietly and watching the two sides sparring in the boardroom, I think that it would be malpractice, using that word colloquially, not to, at a minimum, talk to the CEO and find a way to enter into that conversation. I was always fortunate because the two CEOs who I serve both welcomed my insights, valued my insights, requested my insights on various occasions, and quite frankly, if there'd been some tension in the board meeting, would almost invariably want to see how I had read it, because I did have long-standing I had worked with the board first as corporate secretary, and then as GC for 20 years. So I had relationships in many cases, particularly with the second CEO, that were longer than the ones he had. And I'd seen these people in action. And sometimes, CEOs have, can get their feelings hurt too. So you have to be diplomatic about how you would bring the subject up. And certainly, the general skills that you're using, would come into play. If your CEO is cranky at 5 PM, you probably, make that appointment for 10 in the morning if you're going to have a chat about what happened at the last board meeting and maybe how the management team could have done a little better. But I think that it would really be a dereliction not to try and help the parties moderate the differences.
Yeah, Susan, I strongly agree with you. And that's where, when we talk about the skills that a general counsel should have, obviously the subject matter expertise and, presence and, but I think diplomacy and mediation skills, if you will, really come in handy in those situations. Now let me make the questions even harder. This is something that does come up. What do you do if the board or the CEO takes you into his or her confidence about a problem? And what if they place you right in the middle and tell you stuff that's really important and insist that you not share it? For example, what if a CEO tells you in confidence that he's looking to leave and is actually interviewing, and it's during a period where there's, let's say, a challenging acquisition, and it would be a problem for the company to have the CEO surprise the board and walk out the door? Or alternatively, if the lead director tells you confidentially that because of the CEO's failure to make management changes, for example, the board is dissatisfied and is considering a change. Does your loyalty, I'll pick on you, Bart, does your loyalty go to your boss, the CEO, or at least one of your bosses, or the board? How do you handle these situations?
As I mentioned, I've been in that situation. I guess my first answer to your question, how do you handle the situation, is the same answer that the zookeeper gave when a kid asked her, how do you feed the bears? Very carefully. First of all, basic principle with which we're all familiar is that the lawyer's duty, obviously, including the general counsel, is to the corporation, not to any individual. Having said that, obviously, to serve the corporation effectively, you need to have a good relationship with, if you're the general counsel, the CEO, the other C-suite members, and the board. I have been in that situation, and what I did, which I think was pretty successful to manage it, was to be always as open and transparent as possible with the board or the CEO, as the case may be, to the extent appropriate. Now, if the board chair, has happened to me, specifically says, I want to talk to you about something, Bart, and I really don't want you to tell X, the CEO, until I'm ready to tell X. You have to honor that. And I think the same thing. I don't mean you have to honor that as a legal matter. I think you're toast if you don't honor the confidences. Even if the duty of confidentiality runs to the client, you have to have a relationship of trust and confidence with both the CEO and the board, including the board chair. At the same time as I did that, and I was the recipient of confidences coming the other way from the CEO, I always encouraged the board and the CEO to be as open and transparent, to accelerate the time at which disclosure, at which discussions could be had about the sensitive subject to the extent possible. So to me, there's no, and this has to do, I think, with a lot of the relationship between the board and the CEO and the general counsel, kind of in the middle. Professionalism, openness, transparency within the limits of what's appropriate, and promotion of that between the board and the CEO. To me, that was the only way to go, and I had pretty good success with it.
Susan,
well, I can certainly envision times, and I'd be interested in your views, Noah and Bart, where you would actually feel compelled to tell one or the other, you really need to have this conversation. You board chair need to talk to the CEO, or do I have permission in this instance to say something to the CEO, or vice versa? I would think there could be situations where part of your role would actually, again, when we're talking about mediating, I'm not talking about that in any formal sense, but where part of it could be actually saying, we've now reached a point where it's time to have a conversation. Right. I think about this a little bit the way I think about ethics complaints, where people want anonymity and you have to say, yeah, you'll have anonymity until I can't do it anymore. I mean, there's a little bit of that flavor to it.
Yeah, so how do you have that conversation with the CEO though? Because like you, I've been in situations where a client, somebody in the company says, can I talk to you in confidence? And you always have to preface it in the same way. But approaching a CEO when it comes to something like that is obviously far more challenging.
Again, it's tricky. You have to rest on a relationship, which in my case I was fortunate to have built over many years of trust and confidence. But to Susan's point, that's actually what I was referring to when I said within the limits of that relationship, I always did what I could to help bring the parties together and promote communication as soon as possible. And in some cases that involved conversations such as, Susan, you know, can you talk to so-and-so about this pretty soon? Because I think it'll make things better for everybody. So, you know, it's an art, but it's something that I always worked at. That I never had a situation where I felt compelled by law or ethics to disclose a confidence, because it was not actually a confidence in which I was bound by the attorney-client privilege, which runs to the corporation. Never had that situation.
Fortunately, neither did any of us, I think.
But certainly had the situation where it was my role to encourage early discussions to see if I could move the process along toward open communication, maybe sooner than, in some cases, the CEO on the one hand or the board chair on the other hand were naturally inclined to do.
So let's move to this actual search. You know, whether it's a planned departure or not, the process needs to take place. And I want to kind of discuss a little bit, and Susan, maybe you can help us here, about, you know, sometimes, as Bart mentioned, the GC's involved in the process, attends the search committee meetings, other times not. It depends on the situation, the company, and the board. But does the GC have an overarching responsibility to ensure that the right kind of process takes place?
Yeah, I think that I don't have any problem with a board conducting a search. I mean, particularly a good, strong board conducting a search without the GC in the room. They're likely to work with somebody in management just for scheduling and all that kind of thing. But I do think that the GC has an affirmative obligation to understand what the planned process is, to make sure there's a good record of that process, to make sure that it would, withhold, I guess, sort of the floor responsibility to make sure that it would withstand evaluation under the business judgment rule. But I do consider that a floor. I mean, quite frankly, that it would be a process that the company, if ever, subjected to scrutiny, would be proud of. And I think that if the GC gets involved early, they can, have conversations with the board chair, with the head of HR, if they end up being the management liaison, to make sure that those procedural steps are met, that if the company, that if the board is really clearly going to be selecting an internal candidate, that they take some cautionary steps to make sure that that decision withstands scrutiny. And then just to, again, I see that the practice of corporate governance is for the most part a very procedural practice, and I would apply the same analysis to that as to other issues and decision-making issues as I would here. And I would very much see a responsibility for the GC to have a counseling role to make sure that whatever the board does is something that that the company would be proud of in the unlikely event that it was ever really seriously challenged.
So, so now we're at the point where a search is taking place, and oftentimes there's a lot of internal pressure. Many times there'll be an internal candidate. There might even be more than one internal candidate. And you may be, as the general counsel, as I was, very close with one or more of the internal candidates, actually friends with them. Have either of you faced that situation, and how do you handle that?
I have in the CEO succession process that I've mentioned. The way it worked was that the process started a little more than 2 years out from the time the CEO was actually to depart. And the CEO was given a chance, of course, to promote a successor. What the CEO chose to do in that case was to bring somebody in from the outside, somebody the CEO knew well from a prior professional relationship, highly regarded in the industry, brought that person in the C-suite to a senior executive position. At the same time, when the process was first disclosed to the other C-suite members, the members of what we call the management committee, the senior executive committee, there was a clear focus on convincing people, which I have to say was not always entirely successful, that this person who was brought in didn't have a lock on it, because there were other very well qualified internal candidates. There were 3, each of whom had the ambition of succeeding the CEO. The board ran a process that was very thorough, engaged a search consultant, one of the major national executive search consulting firms, defined the characteristics working with the board, working closely with the nominating and governance committee, that the board wanted to see in a new CEO, and went through the process of screening and eventually interviewing both outside candidates and the inside candidates, including the person who sort of was, but was not totally positioned to be the heir apparent. By the way, that person ultimately got the nod. Now, in terms of your question, yeah, I was quite friendly with other members of the C-suite. But I have to say, I guess I'll go back to the same principles. In this process, I was friendly. I certainly never shied away from even having lunch with people. But at the same time, arm's length. I never wanted to give anybody the impression that he or she had an inside track, or that anybody had an inside track. I never wanted to have offline discussions of the CEO selection process. So that was just something that I would not discuss with even people I was quite close to in the C-suite. And they all understood that, and I think they all respected it, but I couldn't do it otherwise. Otherwise, I think it would just be too fraught. Again, it worked out. We didn't immediately lose any C-suite members when the heir apparent, the person who wasn't the heir apparent, was eventually named as the CEO's successor. But it's, again, a tricky process, and I think even-handedness and professionalism, and to a certain extent, even with people you're close with, certain clearly understood, even if not articulated, rules of the road to keep things at arm's length and even-handed. You need to communicate them, even if you don't say them in words. Again, I don't remember ever having that discussion with anybody, but everybody knew that I wasn't going to give anybody the inside track or inside advice or offline advice about the CEO selection process.
Yeah, I was at one time put in the challenging position of being asked whether I thought any of the internal candidates were appropriate successors to the then CEO. And albeit people that I really liked and respected, I had to say no, that if we could find somebody on the outside with a certain amount of, expertise, gravitas, et cetera, that might be the way to go, which is what the board did. But that was an uncomfortable position to be in.
Well, I just want to leverage off of something that Bart said. I think that one of the perhaps tricky aspects of being a GC, but but I think really critical ones is the perception within the company that you're an honest broker and that you play sort of all decisions even-handedly, and that you are, you know, can be trusted with, you know, the most important confidences within the organization, because people know that you will not mishandle them. And I think that the situation of having a CEO succession where there's several internal candidates just takes that, first of all, the reputation, which hopefully you've built over the previous years, puts it to the test, both in terms of your practical application of it, but also the continued perception of you in that light from senior management. And then, quite frankly, from the most personal standpoint, if you blow it, you know,
Right. You're toast.
You're done. Yeah.
you've got a fair amount of downside there. And I actually remember having a conversation at the end of our CEO succession where there had pretty quickly boiled down to two internal, very, very strong internal candidates, and talking to the one who did not get the nod very, you know, shortly afterwards, and you know, having a pretty strong, a pretty nice personal conversation where I said, you know, I can't have favorites, but let me tell you, I know this was tough, et cetera, et cetera. And his response was, yeah, you can't have favorites. I get that. And it was, I felt pretty good about the fact that that I'd actually managed down that balance beam pretty successfully.
Yeah. It becomes, I think, and we talked about this, if you're in that position and a board member asks you which one you think would be the stronger CEO and you have an opinion, you gotta give it, I think.
Yeah, I did that. I mean, certainly the Nominating and Corporate Governance Committee met with me in executive session, as did the outside search consultant, and asked me pointed questions about the qualifications of the internal candidates, and I answered them honestly. But what I'm saying is that, you know, I answered them honestly and, you know, factually, in the sense that I wasn't cheerleading for anybody. I was giving feedback to the extent I could with examples in response to a very carefully worked out set of specifications, not the formal requirements of the job, because I think the formal requirements of the CEO's job are pretty uniform across companies, but what was the board really looking for? I did that, but I certainly would never, as Susan said, I would within the company, outside of that cone of silence, that confidential conversation with the board, I would certainly never give anybody in the company, even people I was very friendly with, the sense that I would, you know, help coach them or talk to them offline about the process or play favorites in any way. As Susan said, I think that's critical.
Yeah, so over the years, I've talked to GCs about, you know, whether they were privy to the process that boards go through, how involved they were. And it really does differ from companies to companies, and also depends on how involved the head of human resources is as well. I had a situation where I wasn't privy to the process. You know, I knew obviously what was going on. It was kind of updated. But then the board decided they had to bring me in because they were considering a potential CEO from a competitor with non-compete issues. And that allowed me to come under the tent, and thereafter became part of the process, which was a really interesting thing to, you know, to actually, you know, be a part of. I want to make sure that we get into issues about kind of relating to the new CEO and the like. But very quickly before we do that, do you think, Susan, it makes sense, like the CEO has been decided, she or he has been named, does it make sense to reach out and try to form a relationship with the CEO before she starts?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in the underlying, this is an outsider. Presumably, if it was an insider, you'd already have a relationship. So the nature of the conversation might be different. But in either event, you're going to want to reach out. In the inside event, it's probably congratulations and let's get on the calendar. In the outside one, I think that it would probably be a longer conversation, one where you thought a little bit more based on your own research about their background, about how you could start to introduce yourself and some of the ways you can be helpful to them during the upcoming transition.
Yeah, I had a situation where, unfortunately, I got to know the incoming CEO by negotiating portions of his contract. Not necessarily the introduction you necessarily want to have, but in the end, it worked out well. And I think it actually was helpful because I learned how he thought and how to interact with him early on. So I think that helps. So when a new CEO starts, there's a lot of things I think that go through the mind of a general counsel. You know, on a positive note, how can the GC help the CEO get acclimated? How can I gain the trust of the CEO, both personally and for my team? The need to understand her vision, and what kind of changes the CEO is envisioning, and then kind of more narrowly, how does the CEO view lawyers and what their role should be in a company? Now, John, bringing you into the conversation, I know that Barker Gilmore has done some really outstanding research on what CEOs want from general counsels. Maybe you could talk for a few minutes about those findings, because I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about.
Yeah, that sounds good. And it is getting used to what that CEO's expectations are, getting informed of those expectations when you have a new CEO coming into play. Interesting enough, we just, as you mentioned, we just completed a survey. We interviewed 100 general counsel of private and public companies. And we found that the CEOs fall, I don't know if I said general counsel, but 100 CEOs of public and private companies. And what we found is they fall into one of three categories. One, they've experienced a strategic advisor from a general counsel, and they can't live without one. Two, they've never had a strategic advisor from a general counsel, but they're craving one. And three, they've never had a strategic advisor to the business as a general counsel, and they don't want one. So obviously the number one, the majority were CEOs who experienced the value that a strategic advisor can bring, and that's what they want. That's what they insist on. But one thing that I learned a long time ago was trying to convince a CEO that they want something that they don't think they want. And I was kicked out of the boardroom for doing so. I learned that you have to work your way in slowly. So I think the upfront is understanding what a CEO is looking for. And I'll just say this, that if a CEO is a bit stubborn and feels that, okay, the GC can report to my CFO or my COO, you don't have to report directly to me because I have too many reports and I really don't need their direct counsel. I'll just say that it's not something that you have to throw a red flag and say, okay, this isn't going to work out. We've seen general counsel do that. They come in with a CEO like that, and they work their way into it where they prove the value that they can bring. The board sees it, the CEO sees it, and then ultimately the position gets elevated to reporting directly to the CEO. I will say when we go out to search, if somebody has been a sitting general counsel reporting to the CEO and has been viewed and acted as a strategic advisor, they don't want it any other way. So many times we do get GC candidates because there is a new CEO in town and they can't live with the decision that, one, I'm going to be demoted to report to someone else, or two, this person doesn't respect me as a strategic advisor. So that does happen. But, you know, if I come out or a recruiter approaches someone and says, hey, I have this opportunity for a new general counsel. If you are a sitting general counsel, you're probably, and it doesn't report to the CEO, as a sitting general counsel, or if I reached out to any of the three of you, you would immediately scoff at it and say, I'm not interested. But if I reach out to somebody who's not a sitting general counsel, it can be a great opportunity to become the enterprise general counsel and either work your way into that position as a strategic advisor by showing the value you bring, or ultimately you'll get recruited by another company where a CEO will have a difference of opinion. So the bottom line is you can't stereotype it.
Right. I completely agree, John. So we had a great question. Someone asked, what do you do? Is there anything you can do when a CEO insists on bringing a whole new team? And, you know, that's the message. And you know that's kind of what his intent is. And, you know, I think the answer is, and I'm curious, Susan and Bart, what you think. I think the answer is that there may well be situations where, you know, the CEO is hell-bent and, you know, that's it. It's a done deal. But having said that, and we're going to talk about this a little more, I think there are things that a general counsel can do to convince a new CEO that you're prepared to understand and embrace his or her vision for the company, that you're adaptable, you know, that you want to be part of the new team. Some of you do, but you know, I think it may well be an uphill battle, but I think there are ways to convey to a CEO that it's in her or his interest to keep you on board, especially if everyone else is going, because the general counsel, especially long tenured ones that really know the company, know where the bodies are buried, have a real value to, you know, to a new CEO. Susan or Bart, any thoughts on that question?
I guess I would say that I would assume that in most situations where a new CEO comes and is given carte blanche by the board to replace the entire senior management team, that it's a company in trouble. And I think that under those circumstances, it may be very difficult for the CEO to distinguish themselves from all the other people who put the, you know, put the company in whatever situation it is. But if you have a case to be made there, if you are that neutral arbitrator with the long company history who has sort of a track record of supporting strategic initiatives and being a constructive, you know, force within the senior management team, give it a try. You know, give it a try. Make your case to the new CEO. I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't give up. I would keep doing I'd keep doing the things I've been doing, and you know, demonstrate that I was completely willing to make that transition and to be the same constructive source for the new person.
Susan, you know, I talk about orienting a new CEO. So when you had a new CEO came in, how did you go about orienting the new CEO? What role did you play, and what did you do?
Sure. So I had two different situations. One was when I became corporate secretary to someone who had only been the CEO for, you know, about 6 months. And then the other was when I was the GC, and it was an internal transition. And the thing I would say about the internal transition is that even if it is an internal person who's been with the company a long time, and even if it is someone who has interacted with the board in the past, they've never been the CEO before. They've never been perhaps the chairman of the board before. And there is an enormous amount that you can do to get them where you can explain, you know, a lot of the underlying mechanics of the board process that they may be unaware of, where you can explain how it relates to both strategy as well as legal compliance, where you can try and be, you know, helpful in making them look as good as possible in front of the board because of your deep experience. So I think that even with an internal success or with board experience, the mere transition to the new role gives the existing GC a real opportunity to be a help and a supporter for the new CEO. And
I assume if a new CEO has not been a CEO or has like not worked for a public company or is in a new industry, there's even a greater opportunity, I think, to help. Bart, have you had that experience?
Yes, I've had the experience actually a couple of times where a very well-respected executive, well, in the last case, the person who was brought in 2 years before had never worked for a public company until then. So, and in that capacity in which he was brought in, he wasn't really, until the very end, really central in terms of the quarterly disclosure rhythm. And so there was a whole lot, as Susan said, to make sure he understood before or shortly after taking the helm. I always did it mostly in conjunction with others. So for example, on the corporate governance issues, the way the company worked was that each board committee had a so-called executive sponsor. So for the audit committee, it was the CFO. For the nominating and governance committee was actually somebody on my staff, a senior corporate governance lawyer. For the HR committee, it was the head of HR. We also had a risk committee, and it was the chief risk officer. And as I had formal sessions to orient the new CEO on the function of those committees and what they did and their processes, always in conjunction with those people who were the committee liaisons. Also, in addition to committee liaisons, we had a senior lawyer except in some executive sessions, in every committee meeting. And I had those people who they sort of served as secretary to the committee. I had those people in the sessions to discuss the functioning of and the issues coming before the committees with which they were involved. And then there's all the formal stuff about securities law issues, disclosure, and that I did in conjunction with the head senior corporate lawyer and with the chief investor relations officer, including FD and the quarterly disclosure rhythm, the development of the quarterly messaging, the press release, the preparation for the analyst call, the disclosure committee, the sub-certification process, and the certifications. As with anything with a CEO, all of this has to be pretty succinct because the CEO, perhaps never more than when he or she first takes the helm, has too many demands on his or her time. As far as important to have a discussion of materiality, if the CEO, maybe not if the new CEO was a CFO and was very used to the security, SAP 99 and FAS 5 and what materiality really means, but otherwise had that discussion in conjunction with the same people, had discussions about trading, both personal trading, the Form 3 and Form 4 process, 10b5, the 10b5-1 possibility. I involved the treasurer in that discussion, as well as the company's share repurchase program. Right. So it was a pretty formal process. It's formal, but I tried hard to, and I think I succeeded in keeping it very crisp. So
I want to make sure we hit the questions, and I know we're approaching the end of the hour. So the question we got is one of the questions: what's the quickest way to earn the trust and confidence of a new CEO beyond orientation? And I'm thinking of the first 6 months of their tenure. And I'll start. I think there's a few ways to do that. I think really focusing on him or her rather than yourself, because I think a savvy CEO will pick up on the fact that there's a lot of people that are politicking for staff, for budget, et cetera. So if you can help the new CEO understand their biggest challenges and not be the one that's like jockeying necessarily for budget resources, really engaging in active listening, trying to make it clear that you're trying to understand, you're trying to help in any way you can, but really trying to understand their vision for the company, what they're trying to do, and what they want to bring to the company. I think it's a really important time period to, as Susan was talking about, there's nothing more important than trust. Establishing trust with a CEO that you're there to help, to work with her or him, to help them and really serve the company. Susan or Bart, anything you want to add in terms of that question?
Only a
I guess
little.
I would,
Okay, please, Susan.
I would just add quickly, I mean, some of this feels really self-evident, but the CEO has to know that they can speak to you and not worry about it spilling out the other side, any place, anywhere. And you can, I mean, you can articulate that, and then you have to live it. I think a suggestion actually in the prep call, Noah, that you made about bringing the CEO into your staff is both a wonderful thing for your staff, but it's also a wonderful way for you to start establishing with the CEO, I think, that sense of mutuality and trust and confidence. So I think that a lot of it's really what you would do to establish a relationship of trust and confidence in any circumstance. But I do think that sense of propriety and confidentiality and them knowing that you will be there through thick and thin with them, starts with the first meeting.
All right, so this is the last question. I want to make sure we get it in because I think it's an important one, and then we'll close because I know people have a hard stop. Every CEO wants to put their mark on the company, and they want to create a new culture. If you've been with a company a long time, how do you avoid being perceived as the old guard? And if the CEO has a different view, say, of the law department and the role of a lawyer, how do you deal with that? This is something I definitely have views on, but I think either one of you, if you could give me your thoughts on that, because maybe Susan, you were with your company a long time, so maybe if you wouldn't mind addressing that one.
Lawyers by training have new clients all the time, have to switch gears all the time. And I don't think it's any different in an in-house environment in that sense than an outside environment. The new sheriff's in town, you want to support within the limits of the law. You want to support his ideas, his initiatives. You want to be, the same kind of cheerleaders too strong, because you do have to have this little bit sort of, more moderated view. But I don't think there is anything particularly in the role of the general counsel that should prevent you from establishing right off the bat that you are on the new team, you are with the new track, and that's sort of a professional attribute that you come to the table with.
So one very kind of narrow piece of advice I have is to avoid the temptation, and this pertains to your point, Susan, whether it's a new CEO or whatever level position, somebody comes in from the company and has what they think is a new idea that you've looked at over the years repeatedly. So you need to bite your tongue and not say, we've tried that, it didn't work, because it may work in the current time and she or he may have a different spin. So I think that's an important one. And I unfortunately think we're out of time. I do want to thank my esteemed co-panelists, Susan and Bart. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And let me turn it over to John for a few closing comments.
That's great. And I'd like to reemphasize Noah, Susan, and Bart, just how much we all appreciate you donating your time and sharing your wisdom from all the years of experience. So we really do appreciate that. And we appreciate everyone showing up and taking advantage of the webinar. We will be sending out about a 1-minute survey. We value your input. If you can take a minute and fill it out, give us some grades, give us your thoughts. And if anyone has any insight on any topics that they would be interested in future webinars, we're all ears. We'd love to hear from you. And if anyone is looking for a top shelf advisor that's experienced pretty much anything an advisor could experience, Noah, feel free to reach out directly to Noah or reach out to Bob Barker or me, and I'll be glad to help you out. If anyone's looking themselves for a new general counsel opportunity, or potentially hiring a successor or a strategic hire for their team, I'm always happy to talk to people, keep you on my radar, and or work through a search with you. So very happy to stay in touch with anyone. We're very open. Send us an email, jgilmore@barkergilmore.com, or reach out to Noah directly. And we hope to see everyone again. So thank you very much, and look forward to October and November's upcoming webinars. Going to be just as good, and I think everyone will get a lot of value out of it. So thanks again. Everyone stay well. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.